the live feed to the control room like 10 minutes before the landing. So I watched it closely, and it was amazing.
Yeah.
Like just to watch that in real time and see the people working on it, just how emotional they were getting about the fact that, there was a period of time where they just had to cross their fingers and hope that nothing screwed up while it was going dark, and, a couple minutes lag from the information. It's amazing.
Yeah, and any of those missions, I always love it when they show all the people that have, like you said, have been working on it for so long, and they've just got so much invested in it. And then when it happens, everyone's just so excited. Yeah, no, it's awesome.
Yeah, and then yesterday I saw an image. It might have been on like Twitter or something of some of the control room planning at the Jet Propulsion Lab on how they were deciding on the landing site, and they were actually using a software which is called ArcGIS, which is the industry-leading geographic information software for mapping and spatial data management. And I was going to talk today a little bit about like the fundamentals of how to make digital maps. I might switch gears and do that next week. But it was cool to see another planet on the cartographic layout of that software, because traditionally the entire system is built around the Earth coordinate system and GPS positioning around Earth. You never think of the fact that they have these digital projections and coordinate systems for other planets too.
Yeah.
Like if you ever look at Google Earth, you can switch over to Google Mars and see the whole planet in 3D, right? That's using a coordinate system for Mars.
How do you switch over to Google Mars? You just type it in?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if you open up Google Earth, and I think I've got it here on my computer, there is an option to switch to Mars.
I wonder if we could zoom in on the spot where the Perseverance landed, in that delta there, the river delta, or the old that they think.
Yeah. Where is it? I don't see the option. It's been a long time since I've done the Google Earth Mars thing, but I mean, it's not very good resolution. You're looking at imagery. At least the last time I looked at it, the resolution was pretty bad, right? So maybe it looks like you're squinting and blurring your eyes at all the stuff in the digital realm, but yeah. Anyway, so today I was gonna zoom out and kind of look at some of the applications of the information we've already talked about.
Sounds awesome.
More specifically, looking at some of the research I did for my PhD field work. The reason why I was traveling to all these different tropical forest sites and building towers, and touched on that a little bit in my first chat and a little bit last week on the remote sensing stuff, but we can actually look at some applied use cases. How does that sound?
That sounds awesome.
Okay.
Right. We're a little light on numbers today. I don't know for what reason, but no, this is awesome.
All right, and I'm happy to just go open discussion. If you guys want to talk anything related to, remote sensing technologies or satellites or GPS or map making or light detection and ranging, we can just do a discussion session to start if you want.
They aren't looking particularly discussion ready here. It's like,
okay.
Like they all went to McDonald's for lunch and maybe just overextended a bit.
Okay, well, here we'll get some pictures up and some concepts out there, and if anything catches your guys' interest that makes you go, huh, or you don't understand it, then we can talk about it a bit more. But here I've got a few different presentations. I'll just grab some random slides from them. These are from years past, when I was at the University of Alberta giving talks. It was kind of cool. So this was actually a talk I gave at City Hall to the general public. They asked me to come present as part of their centennial anniversary of the university They did this festival of ideas, and they got 5 guest speakers doing research on cool projects, and I got picked to give that talk. So I talked about, how do we actually monitor the breathing of the earth? And 2 weeks ago, I showed you guys those images, or those little short videos of the earth almost looking like a heartbeat, or a lung breathing in and out. So kind of the big idea of, why do we care? Why do we want to measure that? We talked last week about some of the ways that we can do that, and the principles underlying how we measure that stuff. But really, why do we need to do that? So I already gave you guys an introduction to Earth system science, but just a reminder there, it's integrating all the different spheres of how our world works, from the living and the non-living systems, and how they interact and influence each other. So for those of you that have seen some of the BBC documentaries, actually, I should send you guys a link to one that is really, really, it's all about Earth observation satellites. And there's some amazing graphics that they do. And they put false color, like I showed you guys last week, using different spectrum of light. They put a lot of false color, computer graphics into things that are normally invisible, like how water vapor moves through the air from the oceans to make clouds, and all the things we can see from satellite. But it helps you visualize it. I'll look that one up, and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, that'd be cool. That sounds awesome.
Yeah. I think it's called Earth from Space. Yeah. And it's a BBC documentary. The other one worth mentioning, maybe you haven't heard of it, because I believe it's from the 1970s, called The Powers of 10.
Powers of 10.
Yeah, they made us watch it in grade school. I think like Science 10.
I remember watching it.
Oh yeah, someone says they remember watching it.
Yeah, it opens on like a scene of 2 people on a picnic blanket, and I think it starts zooming in on their cells, and then another power of 10 further zooming is like molecular processes in DNA. And it just keeps going deeper and deeper, and then it goes all the way out to this cosmos and the largest features in the universe. And it's an old video, and it almost looks a little cartoony, but it really hits the concept on the head of trying to measure really, really, really small microscopic processes, and how those processes over really large scales, really shape the world that we live in. And so the example I was thinking of was when a big windstorm in the north of Africa blows dust from the desert into the air and moves it across the ocean. It fertilizes the ocean, and the iron in that dust that goes into the ocean then causes the algae and all the different phytoplankton that are producing energy from sunlight and water. It causes those to bloom, and it just creates a massive oxygen outburst. I think about half of the air that we breathe comes from the ocean. So I'm going to talk a lot today about the lungs of the earth, referring to the forests, because those are the photosynthetic domains that we experience on a more regular basis. Most of us don't live in the ocean. So we're familiar with how plants give us air. But it's important to remember that it's actually the photosynthetic critters in the ocean that generate most of the air that we breathe. So they're not looked at as much in this presentation, because they're not as cool as forests. But yeah, those are the kind of interactions that we're talking about on the whole big picture. How something that happens in one place on the earth can influence what happens on the other side of the earth. Those are called teleconnections. And it's a big part of Earth system sciences. You guys have probably seen more up-to-date figures. This one's a little out of date, but it gives you the whole big picture. The human population has just been exploding over the last 10 generations. The last 10 lifetimes, we've seen the world population just skyrocket. So that puts a lot of pressure on our life support system. And our Earth is the life support system I'm talking about here. And one of the ways we change the Earth's surface is by converting the cover. So last talk, I gave you guys an example of like, what can we measure with satellites using light reflection in space? Well, we can measure whether there's forest, whether there's crops, whether there's no vegetation and there's desert. You can see where there's cities and where there's water. That's called land cover. And measuring land cover is increasingly important in these days with how much we're changing the land surface on a regular basis. And basically, as we grow and we need more food and we need more food for our food, we need to change the land surface to accommodate that growth. And year after year, we see massive changes in forest cover, agricultural land, and that has very real impacts on the air that we breathe and our water quality and the types of things that we would get from the land normally, right? So forests are a extremely useful land cover class. Not only are they really, really productive, so they generate a lot of oxygen, but they actually store a lot of water in their tissues, and by preventing the sun from drying out the land, so they hold a lot of moisture on the land. And they give us wood and materials, medicines, fruits, berries, you name it. I mean, the story of human evolution and human history is so closely tied to our use of forests that without the story of forests, the story of humans doesn't exist. So it's very, very useful to know where the forest is distributed, the kind of health of the forest, how it's changing over time. And that's where our satellite observations are coming in really, really handy. In the past 20 years, we can start to measure year after year the forest extent. So if you ever hear in the news, or if you're big into environmentalism or conservation sciences or activism, we always hear about deforestation, and how we're losing our tropical forests, or we're losing our rare types of different ecosystems. How we measure that is typically from space, but understanding exactly the value of that land cover type. How much benefit do we get from a wetland versus how much benefit do we get from a chunk of forest or a stand of trees? There's an actual dollar value that goes on that when it comes to deciding how much land cover change should we allow before it becomes a problem for us and for all the animals and the critters that live in the environment. So here's a map of tropical forests across the globe. And it's right in the name there. They exist just in the tropical belt of latitude. So just between 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south of the equator. Forests, any forest in that kind of latitude is considered a tropical forest. Now, what do you think of, and just blurt it out, what do you think of when you picture a tropical forest?
We got monkeys,
Yeah.
parrots, jungle,
Yeah.
vines,
Scary insect.
scary insects.
That's right. So biodiversity, right? Lots of different types of animals that you really wouldn't see in the type of forest we have here. You think hot and wet, big trees, jungles. So it's funny because almost half of the tropical forests are actually not very moist and they're not very wet. They're called dry tropical forests. And they're very understudied, but they're essentially different from wet tropical forests in the fact that it only rains for a couple months of the year. So you only get 3, 4, 5 months of the year where rain falls. And the rest of the year it's bone dry, maybe with a random little tiny shower. But they have seasonality. And so basically right on the equator, right cutting through the middle of the Amazon, the middle of Africa, right through Indonesia and Borneo and Southeast Asia. Those are the wet tropical forests because the way that the air of the planet moves is it's always converging right there at the tropics. And as air converges from the north with the south and goes up, it rains. So you basically, it's like clockwork. Every single day at almost the exact same time of day, you get a little bit of rain. As soon as the sun comes out, things heat up, air starts moving up, you get a little rain shower for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It's like clockwork, and it's all year round, every single day. But the second you start moving a little bit more to the north or a little bit more to the south, basically starting around 10 or 12 degrees north of the equator, everything from there to the end of the tropics, which ends, in North America, just above the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. So those of you that have been to like Cancun for vacation, that's kind of like the upper part of the northern hemisphere tropics. It's seasonal rainfall. They only get rainfall in part of the year. And what happens is actually, and I'll show you guys some pictures of this. For those of you who looked at the little booklet I sent Rob of pictures of these types of dry forests, you'll see exactly what that looks like. But essentially, almost half, so 40% of the tropical forests are seasonal. And what happens is when it gets too dry and too hot, the trees have to drop their leaves. It's the same reason that trees here drop their leaves in the wintertime. It's not necessarily that the plants don't like the cold. It's that they can't move water throughout their stems when it's cold. So it gets so cold that water can't move anymore. And it's essentially like not having any access to water anymore. It's a type of drought. So coldness causes water limitations. So it's the exact same mechanism. So the trees here will lose their leaves because they can't use their water anymore. It's solid. But in the tropics, it's just too hot and there's no water coming down. So the trees lose their leaves. It's important to remember that the way that water moves through a tree is like 99% through its leaves. Think of leaves as little tiny lungs. Every single leaf is like a lung for that tree because it's just full of pores that exchange water vapor and carbon dioxide and other gases between the atmosphere and the Earth's surface. So yeah, those little lungs are too expensive to keep out when it's too dry, so they drop them all. And half of the tropical forests do this. But you never think of a dry, crispy forest when you think of a tropical forest.
No, I've never thought of the tropical forest. Like, do they have it? Is it like fall? Wow.
So this is a camera from one of the towers I built in Mexico. If anyone has ever been down to like Puerto Vallarta in Mexico, that landscape on the west coast, that's all tropical dry forest. So if you go there at the right time of year, it's nice and green and lush and looks like a jungle type landscape. But the other half of the year, it looks like our deciduous forests do. There's very few leaves on the tree. It's crispy and dry, and it's just bare branches.
So if it does rain, are those trees unable to take advantage of it, or do they have special adaptations, or is it just happen so rarely that it just doesn't, and this is just they go dormant for these particular months, and then they start to get their foliage back?
Yeah, so those are the questions that we wanted to better understand from a scientific knowledge perspective. For every one study done in a tropical dry forest, there's 200 that have been done in the wet forests.
Oh. So
less than 1%, half of 1% of the scientific knowledge on our tropical forests are on the dry forests. We don't know very much about these ecosystems compared to the wet forests, which is surprising because humans actually settle and build cities in dry forests 99 times more of the time, 99% more often.
Why do you think it's the the wet ones that get studied that much more, just because of do you think it's because of the biodiversity or some of the kind of the flagship species that live there? Or
It is, yeah, it's the megafauna, the big charismatic animals that live more often in the wet forest year round.
right, like an orangutan?
In the dry forest, the same animals will go to the dry forest seasonally, the ones that migrate back and forth. They'll think of the wet forest as the city, like the hustle and bustle. There's always competition, lots of resources. There's tons of interactions going on with other animals. So when they get the opportunity to get out of the big, busy city, they'll move down to the dry forests when they're wet and productive to take advantage of these environments that for part of the year are just asleep.
Wow, cool.
So there's this big migration that goes back and forth between the wet and dry areas for animals that can move around like that.
And so I guess that would be another reason why it'd be so important to be looking at, the canopy cover, right? Where are, how connected is the landscape for these animals to be able to migrate back and forth, right?
Yeah. So the other reason is the trees typically grow much bigger. The type of trees that can't survive in the dry tropical forests are the bigger trees that just get year-round growth in the wet forest. So you get a taller canopy, usually more canopy layers with vines and all sorts of crazy cool. So they're visually more appealing, which is why more people study them. Is they're taller forests, bigger trees in general. The Brazilians call the dry forest the lazy forests, because they go to sleep for half of the year and they only grow a little bit every year. So they call them the lazy forests.
Oh, that's awesome.
And people used to think that they had no value at all. They're not very valuable forests. So they would clear cut them and put in agricultural crops. So actually, the historical studies that our lab did, so I worked for a group funded by an international global change organization that funded a project from Alberta called the Productivi Initiative. And we went in. So this is where I got all my funding to go down and build towers and meteorological stations and put in all these cameras and remote sensing validation stations for satellites. That was one of the three pillars of the group. So the Productivi research projects looked at the human culture and the human communities in the dry forest. How do people that live more traditionally off of nature get their livelihoods from the forest? What are they doing when they go out and they collect stuff from the woods? And are they hunting their food in the woods? So that human component. Then we look at the ecological component and look at the biodiversity, and we look at the types of species that are only found in the dry forests. And then the remote sensing side was, how can we measure those things, those human and those biophysical interactions? How can we measure that from space? So we were measuring in all those different areas. And then our job with the remote sensing was to say, how can we actually estimate human activity, human well-being, wildlife diversity using satellite measurements?
Wow.
And so we've cut over 50% of the tropical dry forests in the last 200 years. The interesting thing about the dry forests is they actually are where we got most of our root crops. So if you think of yams and you think of sweet potatoes and you think of any plant that's like a starchy potato, cassava, and there's literally a list of like 200 types of like root plants. They've all originated in these ecosystems because in the dry season, the plants need these underground reserves. So they put all their energy into putting their resources into the ground and into these tubers that human societies have actually evolved in close evolutionary relationships with to harvest. The list of things that we actually get in our culture and most tropical cultures are from the dry forests of the tropics, not the wet forests.
Huh.
So this is a picture of what the forest looks like from the tower, a week before it rained, 1 week before the rainfall came. And I think it's June that the first rains hit here. This is near Puerto Vallarta. And this is what it looks like 3 weeks later. Like the leaves sense that the rain is coming and they put leaf buds out. and they wait for the rain to actually fall, and then the leaves open up. And I have some time-lapse videos of this. I could actually look that up right now and see if we can find it.
Just curious, when the leaves are falling off, do they change color like ours do here, or is it a quicker process for them and they just drop?
Yeah, I would say it's a shorter process than here.
Wow.
It's a shorter process. So I'll show that really quickly again. This was a little trail camera I set up. Just take a picture every day at noon. So each one of these frames is a day. So there's the end of the dry season and the first rainfall. And then literally 1, 2, 3, each one of these frames is a single day. And it only took 10 days to go from no leaves to full tropical forest.
Wow.
So these plants are just waiting. They're so thirsty that the second the rain comes, they take advantage of it. Now, the question about when the leaves come off is here, when it gets cold, it's usually a cold snap that comes in, and that's like a light switch. Water freezes, freezing tissues get damaged, and they don't work again. After, you get frostbite on your hand and it thaws out, you're still going to have a lot of problems with your hand. On the other side of the coin, in the hot heat, trees can pull water out of their leaves and branches and stuff it in their stems and into their roots when it gets too hot, which happens usually slowly over time. And then when moisture returns, they can push it back out, and the tissue doesn't get as damaged. So we call it the brown down. So that what you just watched was the green up, and then the brown down is when the leaves start to fall. It happens a little bit slower, but what's interesting is, well, I'll just show you what's interesting.
Well, because when last time when we were thinking about the breathing earth, I was really thinking about the boreal forests, the big deciduous forests all across the northern hemisphere going across the globe. So thinking about the breathing dry forest and the breathing kind of that area, I just figured it was always just producing huge amounts of oxygen.
Yeah, let's see if we can find that one again here. Might be this guy. There's the poles, and this will give us a bit more of an insight into the middle part of the planet. So there you go. If the equator is running through the top of South America, right through the middle part of Africa, you can see the greenness move up and down around the equator. That is in perfect sync with the patterns of moisture in our atmosphere. And so when we talk about climate change having an impact on the desertification of areas, the increasing of desert cover, what's happening is in areas where it's right on the edge of being tropical wet and tropical dry versus very arid, a desert, you get this kind of fine balance where the composition of types of plants and animals that are there are always under this pressure of how much rain is going to come this year. If it's a little bit, can I tolerate that for a year? Probably. If it's just a little bit of rain for many, many years, I got to get out of there. I can't live there anymore. If I'm a plant, if the change happens slowly, I'll migrate over time through several generations. Animals that can get out of there, they'll do it. If they can migrate through an intact corridor, they can do that. On the flip side, some areas it's raining more. It's raining more and more every single year. Areas that are used to having 4 months without any water falling might have big random dumps of rain that don't normally happen. And if that happens year after year, more and more frequently, you'll start to get a shift the other way. You'll get different types of animals that come in that normally live in wetter areas that'll start to compete against the animals and plants that are there. So that's how we see land cover change naturally over decades, sometimes centuries, and sometimes thousands of years. The questions we have is, the rate that the climate is changing from the excessive amount of heat that is building up in the atmosphere, we want to know if these ecosystems on the edge can give us early warning signals for the trends that are happening in those areas. So the area that we worked in Brazil the most was, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but
Yeah.
right here in that southeast part of Brazil, you can see how dry it gets for part of the year. It just goes bone dry and everything goes brown.
Is that the grotto, like the prairies there, or like where the anteaters are and the big termite mounds?
Yeah, it's the world's largest, well, actually, I don't know if it's the largest savanna. I think the Great Plains in Africa and North America are larger, but
Okay.
it's the world's most biodiverse savannas, where you've got some trees, but mostly shrubs and grasses. A lot of this area is covered in that. And the areas that are a little bit more locally humid, it could be a river valley or a mountain valley. That's where the dry forests grow, the seasonally dry forests. Yeah, you get some really cool animals in there, like the giant anteater.
Yeah. And we there was a group of us that had a documentary class last round of courses, and we watched a documentary on that very area. So it was cool.
Yeah, so the questions we had was, well, I should clarify this term. So measuring seasonality of ecosystems or organisms' life cycles is called the science of phenology. Phenology is just cyclical events. So, you know, the migration of the birds every year in and out of here is a phenological event. And what we were looking at was measuring the phenology of environments, looking at the vegetation and specifically leaf phenology. So when do the leaves come out? When do they drop? And that's a key indicator for ecosystem change.
So would that be, would you guys be trying to establish like a baseline of phenology, like looking at, okay, how often do you do this? And then looking at that over time and how is it changing in relationship to what we know that's going on in the atmosphere as far as the amount of, carbon dioxide or?
That's right. So one of the things we wanted to know was when these seasonally dry forests don't get enough rain, are they losing more carbon than they're sequestering out of the air? You know, some plants have a strategy where they'll start dumping lots of carbohydrates and sugars into their roots in these dry forests, which is, the tubers that I talked about in potatoes and types of food that lots of animals, including us, like to eat. But trees do it too. Trees have a very close connection with the climate and the weather changes. And if they've got, something like 2 dry seasons in a row that are extra long, they'll start putting extra resources and sugars and energies into their reserves. And when that happens, they can actually sequester more carbon than you would expect. So there's a lot of questions that we had about how the carbon, the water, the productivity in general, how much leaf growth is happening every year, was changing as the climate patterns are changing in these areas. We have computer models of climate change that can tell us in any given area, do we think there's going to be more frequent or more intense rainfalls year after year? Is that going to keep increasing? Or is it going to go the other way? And the predictions for South America, for most of Brazil, the Amazon included, is that the dry season length is going to increase and the intensity of the dry season is going to increase. All of these computer models show this. This is why they say that, the Amazon is burning more. We remember some of the fires in the news last year. Is the predictions 20 years ago suggested this might happen. And then we started seeing from satellite that it actually was happening, that less rain was falling in a predictable way in South America. And so as scientists of the Earth system, we wanted to measure how accurate was the satellite data. There's lots of things that can mess up those signals from the satellites in space. I told you guys about how cold it is and all the radiation in space and how it breaks those instruments down. We wanted to make sure that the data we were getting was representing what was actually happening in the real world, and it wasn't an artifact of some correctional error or drift.
So just like, we teach the crew here is, you're triangulating your resources, right? You have one resource that's telling you something, and you're like, yeah, well, we want to make sure that that's accurate, right? So then you're on the ground getting this type of information.
Yeah. So if you guys remember last week, I talked about how plants or leaves can reflect light in different wavelengths to different amounts. So like they really like to absorb blue and green light. And that's because their pigments that they use to photosynthesize use blue and red light. But they reflect near infrared light. They're like a mirror to near infrared light. And what we can do is actually measure the ratio of those two things and say, oh, this is how much leaf area there is. And that's essentially what we're doing from space. But in order to go measure that on the ground, we have to go with some instruments and we have to get them above the canopy. So this is an example of what that looks like. So this is a little light sensor that measures one wavelength of light. This one measures another wavelength of light. And we look up to the sky to see how much comes in. And when we look down to see how much is bouncing off the plants. And this is the kind of data it gives us. We get this green line here is that measurement of how much leaf area is below the tower. So what we're actually measuring is minute by minute changes in the leaf angle, whether they're really happy and when they're too dry, leaves will get wilted, right? And they look like they're pretty sad. So that changes on an hourly basis depending on water availability. And we were measuring, every 30 seconds for multiple years. My job was to go fix those when they break, because monkeys will climb up there and they'll pull the cables apart more often than you'd think. And so this is the type of time series that we start to get is the blue line is rainfall. So the rains start to come and the canopy gets really green and the whole ecosystem is happy. All the plants and animals are back and everybody's eating and playing and eating each other. So we did this across a bunch of different sites to try to see if there's any patterns and how accurate those measurements from space were. And this is that kind of figure of some of the sites that I worked at to do that. So this is how we use some basic principles of how light interacts with vegetation to measure how productive an ecosystem is.
The one down in Argentina there, Cassidy, looks like it's got a bit of a different type of graph. The other ones look kind of like a general kind of predator-prey type graph. One happens and then the other one goes up. But what's going on in Argentina?
This figure here is actually, we put lots of sensors in the understory of the forest because we wanted to measure how much light is also transmitted to the bottom of the forest floor. So we can measure exactly how much is absorbed by the canopy. So this is actually a time series. The brown line is the light throughout this is actually the dry season. So as this light level in the understory goes up, it's because the canopy is losing leaves. This blue line is relative humidity. So we were measuring what are called micrometeorological variables in the understory: humidity, soil moisture, all these plant growth variables that we could closely monitor.
And how important is relative humidity? I guess that's the amount of moisture in the air, right? Is that correct? Because there's relative humidity. There's absolute humidity. There's different.
Yeah, it's the amount of moisture relative to the temperature. So the moisture capacity of any given volume of air is directly related to the temperature of the air.
Right, and now we're seeing with global warming is that we have a lot more moisture being able to be held in the atmosphere. Is that correct? So there's way more up there than there used to be.
Yeah, that's right. So a big concern we have in terms of climate change and global warming is that the extra heat in the atmosphere gives the atmosphere the capacity to hold more moisture.
Right.
And water vapor holds a lot of energy. It's, if you think of steam, right? That's just how quickly you can burn your hand when you put it in steam. way quicker than if you hold it over a fire. The amount of energy transfer coming into a water vapor is extremely high compared to dry air. And so this kind of energy holding capacity of our atmosphere is increasing. Water vapor is actually the biggest concern for global warming and climate change. Most of the storms and natural disasters we're seeing are driven by water vapor, changes in water vapor patterns more than anything else.
And I guess with that, yeah, all the different, the erratic weather events, the different kinds of pressure systems can be really influenced, I guess, more by that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that humidity, I'll give you a diagram here. The humidity level, if you take temperature of the air and humidity of the air, you can actually measure what's called the drying power of the air. And the scientific term for that is the vapor pressure deficit. It's the difference between, if you had a cubic meter of air, 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter of air, how much room is left in the capacity of that volume of air to hold water. And that measurement is extremely important for how plants regulate their ability to breathe. So basically, when this pressure deficit is too high and the drying power of the air is really, really high, plants have to close their mouths. And the scientific term for that is stomata, the little openings on the leaves, right? They close them all up and they just stop breathing. They're holding their breath because every time they open their little pores to breathe, they can't help it, water seeps out. So what they want is for CO2 to come in and oxygen to go out. But when that happens, water vapor sneaks out. There's no way around it. They don't want that to happen, so they have to preserve water and hydration, they have to close up whenever that drying power of the air is too high. And this changes, from hour to hour for every plant out there. And so in the tropics, what we found was that vapor pressure was actually the best predictor of when the leaves were going to decide they're going to open the buds and pop their leaves out. This was unknown to science. We had no idea. This was one of the findings of my PhD work, was that the plants were able to sense when the rains were going to come, when that vapor pressure, which is like the drying power of the atmosphere, suddenly changed. And this happened usually a week before the first rainfall, almost like clockwork.
It's amazing to think of the evolutionary knowledge that's, locked away in trees, right? Like there's so much that we could probably still learn, right?
Absolutely. They're very sensitive to atmospheric conditions on a molecular level that we don't understand yet. It's actually, they have little sensors. They can feel the air pressure change based on the amount of humidity in the air, and they'll change their behavior based on it, their breathing behaviors and their energy production behaviors, how much of their energy they're putting into one type of sugar versus another. And things we never see or never think about. We just think they're kind of just doing their thing at kind of the same rate all the time, but it's constantly changing.
When you talk about like the amount of moisture in the air, I wonder if we could connect that to, you just moved to the Okanagan recently from Calgary. In the winter there, you can have super cold weather, and then but you don't have the same amount of humidity in the air, but you can have the same temperature here. And people always say, oh, it's the amount of moisture in the air. It is colder. So what's your scientific take on this analysis? Or people from the coast, right? It's like they're freezing and it's 5 out, right? But it has to do with the amount of moisture that's in the air and the ability of it to get to your skin, I guess.
Yeah, that goes down to a principle called the boundary layer, and it's biophysics, and biophysics is essentially how living structures experience the physical environment. And when you get down to the cellular level, if you think of like the surface of your skin or the surface of the leaf, the reason we have hair on our arms And the reason why some leaves are really fuzzy and soft, all those little tiny hairs, is they're trying to increase the boundary layer of the surface. And a boundary layer slows the movement of air across it. And it's a fluid dynamics principle that fast moving fluids exchange energy in a different way than a slow moving fluid. So a boundary layer, like same reason we put clothes on, we're increasing the boundary layer so that the air can't move quickly right up against our skin where heat exchanges.
Right, like dressing in layers, right?
Yeah, so that biophysical principle of the boundary layer changes when it interacts with moisture. So if you've got a wet surface versus a dry surface, heat exchanges through that surface differently. So a very, very moist cold is going to feel colder because of the water molecules in the air are interacting with your skin surface more, and heat exchanges quicker.
Mm.
But I'll tell you, when I was living here for 1 month and I didn't have dry and cracking elbows, I've never had that before. I was so happy that my skin didn't need to put lotion on it every single day. It's crazy how dry it is in Calgary.
No, as a kid, my grandparents lived in Calgary, and we'd go out there for Christmas from time to time. And I remember I'd never get nosebleeds unless I was heading to Alberta in the winter.
Yeah. We're getting short on time here. I'll cover one more thing for now, and I'll save the rest of it for another time. Basically, when we built those towers, we only got a measurement in one spot. So what we decided to do is we built these wireless sensor systems that we thought we want to put these sensors all over the place in the forest and get a better representative measurement, more data points, more samples, gives you better statistics. But running these little power cables everywhere through the forest just wasn't working. They were getting chewed up by giant grasshoppers the size of your arm, or anything in the forest, would just come in and just chew it apart. So we had the idea of building a wireless system long before there was such a thing as a wireless sensor. So in 2008, we built the first prototypes of forest monitoring wireless sensor systems.
So is that like Bluetooth? Is that like?
It's like Bluetooth. Bluetooth is one radio protocol. So the connections between the nodes are the individual like data loggers with a sensor on them. It's all radio communication, and the specific protocol and wavelengths of radio that you use has different names. So Bluetooth is one of them. We used something called Zigbee, and Zigbee is a different protocol. We also tried just straight Wi-Fi, and that didn't work very well because Wi-Fi, the wavelengths of Wi-Fi were the same size as the leaves of the trees. And so if you've ever tried to get a Wi-Fi signal through a bunch of trees, it doesn't work very well. You can go like 20, 30 feet and you lose the whole signal. So this was a big guess and test part. What frequency of radio wave do we use to get the signal not only from sensor node to sensor node within the forest, but then back to our satellite base station so we could send the data back to our lab anywhere in the world and analyze it from there. So
Cassie, just on the Wi-Fi, so the Wi-Fi frequency match, is this correct? It kind of matches up with the kind of the frequency that's emitted by the signature that's emitted from the forest, so it makes it difficult to read?
Well, what it is the wavelength. So
Right.
we talked last week about different types of light having different wavelengths. And so the wavelength of a Wi-Fi signal, it is a small range.
Yeah.
It's 2.4 gigahertz. That's why you hear 2.4 Wi-Fi and 5 gig Wi-Fi. That's the wavelength. You invert the frequency to get to the wavelength. So it turns out the wave distance of a Wi-Fi signal is somewhere around 10 centimeters. And those are roughly the size of the leaves in the forest. And the way electromagnetic energy interacts with physical matter is a function of the size of the wavelength and the size of the structure. So just if the wavelength is about the same size as something else, it'll interfere with it.
Right.
Whereas a longer wavelength will go around.
Right.
That's a simple way of thinking of it. But basically, leaves are just water sacs. Leaves are mostly water. They're like 90% water, just like our bodies. And water absorbs most radio signals. So we went in the dry season and we installed our first sensor network ever. It was the very first example of a wireless sensing network system in a forest. And a couple months later, after the leaves all came out, after the rainfall came down, we lost all connectivity in the network and everything shut down. we thought it was the rain, but it was just the fact that the signal couldn't get through the trees anymore.
Oh.
So that was a big learning process. A big chunk of my thesis is actually on the physics and the theory of building a appropriate type of sensor network radio communication system for forest monitoring.
And
No one had done that before.
room for discussion on what doesn't work, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll leave you with is this, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about it if you guys want, but what we're trying to do, not only measuring how climate change is affecting productivity of an individual ecosystem. So if we can actually measure how green it gets every year, if that greenness signal lasts longer, we know that it was a better growing year. You know, if our winter comes early here and our crops frost, causes a lot of issues. I think a lot of apples froze last year because the frosts were a bit severe out here and people weren't expecting that when it happened. So the productivity of the system was severely impacted by the weather. We can measure that for every acre on the planet from satellites and actually build these maps of how much carbon and energy the plants are converting from sunlight into biological materials or biomass. Think of it as solidifying sunlight. You know, all of the energy in the biological living systems on the planet comes from the primary producers, the plants, capturing sunlight energy and solidifying the carbon in the air into materials that are holding energy and chemical bonds to grow through the food chain. So it's very important to know if that pattern that we can map over the whole earth of productivity is changing over time, in case some areas become less productive. And what we see when that happens, if a part of the world starts to become less productive over time, people have to leave the area. So the patterns of human movement around the planet throughout human history have always been closely related to how productive, it's a metric we call primary productivity, that specific location has been over time and how it changes with climate. We know that the main controls of this productivity of the producers, the plants, is controlled by temperature, sunlight, and water. So this is a map that actually shows how those three things come together to influence global productivity. For example, most of the interior of Australia is limited by water. So that's the red here. This is a map of the limiting factors for growth of plants. So here we see blue and purples up in North America. Temperature is the limiting factor. Whereas in the tropics, they got lots of water, they got lots of sunlight, it's hot as heck. But they're limited. Sunlight right here in the middle is limited because of cloud cover, because it's always moist. So there's always water vapor turning to clouds and limiting. So this is a cool map to just look at like how things can be explained, you know, where are the tropical forests and the different savannas and deserts and how the biomes are distributed by the limiting factor of plant growth.
And then, you know, it's not too, you look at like environmental constraints and how, you know, and the ability to access food. And then, you know, you have areas that can access food and you lead to political unrest. And it's all connected, right? And then
that's actually, yeah, that is one of the things we were trying to measure. So this group of, so we were working with Microsoft and a couple other big funding groups to see if we could use signals of stress in these dry tropical forests as predictors for areas that are going to see more human conflict, wars, immigration, emigration, scarcity battles, for geopolitical stability predictions. So that was kind of one of the overarching themes of the whole project was, can we actually predict where there's going to be war and conflict and food shortages based on the long-term trends in how productive the natural ecosystems are?
Wow. What did you find?
There is one figure I can show you that summarizes the findings. It's called dry gains and losses. I don't know if this is going to work. Let's see.
I imagine.
There we go.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this was the map we created based on a 20-year time series of satellite observations that showed all these areas in red have decreasing productivity for the last 20 years. These black ones are stable. There's no change detected in the seasonality of the vegetation. And then there's areas that are becoming more productive. So what we would expect, these red areas, there's going to be increasing challenges for water and food security. And we're going to see people leaving this area, and they're going to go into areas that may not want them there. And it could cause conflicts and could cause violence and could cause all sorts of things that the United Nations wants to predict ahead of time so they can have the appropriate resources for.
What do you think is going to, over time, what's going to happen to, any idea what will happen to our area here, the Okanagan? Any hypothesis?
Yeah, we didn't study this region, but other people have. If you look at primary productivity trends,
like
BC,
because often when we think about, we think about all places, when we think about climate change, we always tend to think of the decreasing of productivity, right? And you're mentioning that in some areas there's increasing productivity, but it's just
Yeah, I'll do some homework and I'll see if I can find one specifically for BC. I've seen them before for forestry, so that foresters can try to predict where to plant tree species that might not grow very well today, but where to start planting them in 10 years.
Well, yeah, they're doing that. They're doing that research right up the Kalamalka Lake Research Forest. We did a tour up there, and they have I think it's 17, 18 different stations all across North America, and they're looking at where should they be planting trees, as the climate changes. So they're planting trees that are ready for the climate that's going to be here.
Yeah, my gut tells me that BC is in a good spot. There's enough topographic variability that
mountains that
control
valleys.
the microclimates. There's going to be lots of habitat that are habitable for humans in the coming century, not necessarily for all the plants and animals that we depend on. So there's going to be a lot of problems solved with genetic hybridization of crops. And BC's in a relatively good spot in terms of climate change. If you look at the rest of the world, we're in one of the lowest risk areas, I would say.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, we
already live on the edge, right, of where it's too cold to live almost.
We chatted with a guy. We did a science speaker series at the library, and a gentleman joined us, and he was looking at global climate change stuff as well, and he was studying the ice in Antarctica and what goes on with the ice. But he said they had a model where he was working at this place in New Mexico, and if the sun went out, he says Tahiti's the place to be. You get a little bit longer to survive in Tahiti. So it's good. It's good to know these things, that we're all right here, and if the sun's gone, head to Tahiti.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. You got a plan. Yeah. So main message of the stuff I covered was that the tropical wet forests are cool. They're not as vulnerable and threatened as the dry forests. And the dry forests are acting like a canary in the coal mine for all of the tropical ecosystems. They're giving us early warnings of things to come that you can't see in the tropics. Number one, because the cloud cover in the wet forest is too high. We don't get good data there. And number two, they give that really strong seasonal signal where the patterns in the seasonal forest here in North America are too noisy. The year-to-year variability is really, really high. So we can't find any clear trends. But in the tropics, it's normally a very stable system year to year. But we're seeing that's getting really disrupted. So that's the cool thing about those
So
ecosystems.
there's less variables in that area, right? I guess then you,
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's cool.
Yeah.
All right, I'll turn the lights on here and we'll do a bit of a reflection circle and see if anyone has any oh, someone's getting the lights. Ah. All right, Dill, you want to start us off while you're up?
Sure. I like the whole part about the dry forests. That was like my favorite part of it.
Yeah, I didn't know about it before, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, they're the forgotten forests of the tropics.
Yeah. Kiefer.
I liked when you were showing like the breathing earth, how it moved. It was pretty cool, I guess.
It's kind of mesmerizing, eh?
Yeah, it is. And then you can really start watching an individual place, you know, and seeing how it changes, right?
Yeah, I was amazed about how interconnected so many things are and the effects like all across the world. And then like Kiefer was saying with the breathing earth, and I was watching, and it seems like there's very, very few places, little tiny bands that are constant, that don't seem, at least from this information, that there is much change. It seems like pretty much the entire globe has something changing throughout the year, but there are a few places that appear at least to have very little change, that they stay constant. So I thought it would be bigger spaces, but it seemed like it was just narrow little bands.
Mm-hmm.
Grace.
I thought the dry rainforest thing were really cool too, because I always thought like rainforests are like wet and humid and all like rainy, but yeah, I didn't really know, because I'm like rainforest is like in the name rain, so I didn't really know if they could be dry.
Yeah, so the rainforest, just to clarify, so when we're talking about tropical forests, there's rainforests and there's dry forests. The same here in BC. We have rainforests in BC, right? So there's temperate rainforests and non-rainforest.
Right. Hello, Victoria.
I thought everything was interesting and everything was cool, and I'm very tired.
Oh,
I'll take it.
Yeah. Oh, we already got Dill. We got Riley. Dig deeper.
Dry forest and the
Oh, you got the.
forest thing.
Yeah, we got another dry forest, wet forest thing. Yeah, and then for me, I just kind of like what Brent was talking about, just the interconnectedness of everything on a global scale. Just going back to our first talk on, you know, when you mentioned spaceship Earth, you know, or that overview effect, right? And just like, man, it's like everything is connected when you start talking about the iron getting dropped in the ocean and that leading to algae blooms, and how that is such, and those algae blooms are also their own driving force in the ocean, and how it's all connected. And it seems like there's a lot that we don't, there's a lot that we don't know. And then there's so much that we think we do know about things, and we still don't know that much. Like I keep thinking about how much trees know, like, you know, back to that, you know, like, and then you talk of, another thing I found super interesting was all the tubers and things that we eat, right? That because they live in those drier areas, they need to somehow hold on to some of their energy or their nutrients, and then they make those tubers. But yeah, and they're just and they're tasty.
Yeah. The other tough part about being in those dry forests when it's the middle of the dry season is you're the only if you're out there, you're the only source of moisture around. So all the little insects can sense that from a mile away, and they'll flock to you. So little tiny flies, and they're called salt bees. They're the cutest little bees. They're like the size of a fruit fly, but they're little tiny bees. They'll crawl in your nose and in your eyes and in your ears and in your mouth, and your skin is just covered with them. I got like something like 45 bee stings my first day working in the forest because I didn't know you had to cover your face and your whole body head to toe. So they're very interesting ecosystems, but they are extreme.
Yeah. Do those little bees? How's their sting? Is it pretty?
No, they don't sting. They just lick all the salt and sweat they can.
So they're up your nose, getting moisture.
Yep.
Cool. Does anyone have any questions for Cassidy? No questions today.
Okay. Well, you can think on that and bring them to me whenever.
I guess I got a little bit of a question. Thinking of right where we are at Fulton, we have this really cool wetlands, and there's all kinds of beaver activity. And I'm looking at, if we're doing a kind of, how do we do remote sensing out there? And I keep kind of coming back to, man, I need to maybe purchase a couple trail cameras. Like, what would be some types of experiments that you could do that would be interesting, that could be like right here? If you have any ideas or anything like that, that would, yeah, I'm thinking like a couple trail cameras might be cool to look at things.
Yeah, you can pull actual, scientific measurements off of any camera like that you leave to take a picture every day.
Yeah.
There's a whole project called PhenoCam, and you basically take every single pixel and you can look at it through time and get a chart of the changes to the plants or whatever you're looking at over time to see how they're growing and changing throughout the season.
Yeah, no, that'd be cool. It'd be cool for us to generate some of our own graphs, to make them meaningful, to look at them and, just kind of get our heads wrapped around, what does graphing look like? What does it tell you, right?
Yeah, you can even submit that to the PhenoCam project, which is a global network of these cameras for citizen science, for people to help validate the changing trends in our environment from climate change, the seasonality of plants and animals.
PhenoCam, citizen science, I'll check that out. Cool.
Yeah, PhenoCam with a PH.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I'll think more on that. I would love to come show you guys how to use a drone to actually make a map. Send it up and take a bunch of pictures, stitch them together, and how you can actually measure stuff off of that. Like, how much water is there, or does that shoreline change throughout the year? And actually, you can measure the change in water volume if you take a picture at the start of the season, at the end of the season.
Oh, that would be super cool. Being so close to the airport, is there issues with using a drone around?
100%.
100%.
Yeah.
Keep it low, or you're just not allowed?
There's a map tool you can use to figure out where you can and cannot fly. I'd have to look at the specific location, but.
Well, we're mobile.
There you go.
Yeah. Cool. All right, Cassie. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, we really appreciate your time. It's awesome.
For sure.
Yeah.
Happy to share.
Thank you.
Okay. Talk to you guys later. Thanks for your time and questions and interest.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, buddy.